My name is Claire Thompson, and I'm 28 years old. My wedding day was supposed to be perfect, until my own mother told me she wouldn't walk me down the aisle. Because my brother had planned his wedding on the exact same day. For most brides, that role belongs to their father. But mine passed away when I was 12, after a long and brutal illness that left our family shattered. In the years since, my mother was the only parent I had left. That's why her refusal hit like a punch to the chest. If you're new here, I share more of my personal stories every day, the kind you don't forget. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next one. When she said it, I thought maybe she was joking. There was no hesitation in her voice, no apology, just a matter-of-fact statement, as if she were telling me she couldn't make it to a lunch date. She told me it was just bad timing, and that she had to be there for him. Like my day was optional. It was more than a scheduling conflict. It was a decision, one that confirmed a suspicion I'd carried quietly for years, that when it came to choosing between us, she would always choose him. My mind didn't stay in that moment for long. It pulled me backward, to the home I grew up in, before everything fell apart. A small, slightly weathered 2-story house with a garden my mother kept bursting with flowers every spring, and a front porch where my father would sit in the evenings. His coffee mug, balanced on the armrest, as he listened to my brother and me tell stories about our day. I remember Saturday mornings filled with the smell of pancakes on the stove and the sound of my father's deep laugh echoing from the kitchen. I remember my mother humming along to the radio while she cooked, pausing to kiss my forehead as I sat at the table doing homework. Back then, I believed those moments were unshakable, that no matter what happened, we'd face it as a family. But forever ended early. My father's illness took him in less than a year. The empty chair at the dinner table, the absence of his laugh, the silence that settled over the house, it all carved a hole in our lives that never fully closed. And somewhere in that emptiness, the balance shifted. My mother began leaning on my older brother, letting him step into roles that pushed me to the edges of her world. I didn't realize then how far that shift would go. I couldn't have imagined that one day, when I needed her most, she would turn away, and that the person who would take her place down the aisle would be the last person she expected. Our home sat at the end of a tree-lined street, a modest 2-story with peeling white paint that my father promised to get around to every summer. From the outside, it didn't look like much, but to me, it was the safest place in the world. Inside, every corner carried a piece of our lives. The scuffed baseboard in the hallway from years of dragging laundry baskets, the faded floral curtains my mother refused to replace, the faint scent of my father's aftershave clinging to the hallway closet long after he'd left for work. Some of my fondest memories were Saturday mornings, when the smell of coffee drifted from the kitchen and my father would be at the stove, making pancakes shaped like dinosaurs or hearts. My mother would stand nearby with her arms crossed, pretending to scold him for the mess. But there was always a smile tugging at her lips. Those mornings felt unshakable, like the kind of traditions that would last forever. But forever is fragile. When I was 12, my father was diagnosed with a rare, aggressive illness. The days that followed blurred into hospital visits, whispered conversations in hallways, and the quiet terror of watching the strongest person I knew shrink inside his clothes. Even then, I thought he'd beat it. He had always been the one who could fix anything. Surely this was just another problem he'd solve. He didn't. One evening, I came home from school to find my mother sitting at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a mug she wasn't drinking from. She didn't need to say the words. I knew. The emptiness that followed was unlike anything I'd ever felt. The house seemed too big, the silence too loud. His laugh, once a daily soundtrack, became a memory I replayed in my head just to remember the sound. In the weeks after the funeral, my mother and I clung to each other. She'd come into my room at night, sit at the edge of my bed, and stroke my hair until I fell asleep. I thought that meant we were going to face the world together. But slowly, things began to shift. My brother, already the more outspoken one, started filling the role my father had left. He helped pay bills, drove my mother to errands, made decisions about the house. At first, I thought it was temporary, that once things settled, we'd go back to the way it was. But my mother leaned into it, trusting him with more and more, while my own voice faded into the background. I tried to stay close. I offered to help, told her about school, showed her my latest art projects. But I began to notice the way her eyes lit up for him in a way they no longer did for me. When I brought home a perfect report card, she smiled politely before turning to ask my brother about his soccer match. Losing my father was the first blow. Realizing that my mother, the only parent I had left, was slowly turning away from me, was the second. And that wound never truly closed. After my father's funeral, life didn't return to normal. It couldn't. The routines we'd once taken for granted seemed to crumble. Meals were quieter. The smell of his aftershave faded from the hallway closet. His chair at the table sat empty for weeks until my mother finally pushed it against the wall. It was like the house itself had exhaled and never breathed in again. At first, my mother and I were bound by grief. We'd sit together in the living room after dinner, the TV playing softly while she absent-mindedly rubbed my back. She told me more than once, "It's just us now. We have to look out for each other." I clung to that promise like a lifeline. But slowly, her focus shifted. My brother had always been confident, decisive, and quick to take charge. Qualities my mother now seemed to depend on. He offered to handle the bills, make phone calls, take her to the bank. She let him. Soon he wasn't just helping her, he was running things. At first, I didn't mind. I thought it was good that he was stepping up, that maybe it took some of the weight off her shoulders. But it didn't take long to see how that new closeness left me outside the circle. I'd walk into the kitchen and find them deep in conversation about finances or home repairs, their voices dropping when they noticed me. When I tried to join in, my mother would tell me gently, "You don't need to worry about this. Just focus on school." It sounded like protection, but it felt like exclusion. The shift wasn't just in conversations, it was in the way she reacted to us. My brother's smallest achievements became events worth celebrating. A decent grade on a college assignment earned him a dinner out. A win in a local soccer game meant she invited neighbors over to brag about him. When I told her about making the honor roll, she smiled faintly and said, "That's nice, honey," before turning to my brother to ask about his next match. When I won first place in an art competition, she suggested I hang the ribbon in my room, then left to make his favorite dessert because he'd had a long day. I told myself it was just the grief talking. That she leaned on him because he reminded her of Dad, because he could handle things she didn't have the energy for. But deep down, it hurt in a way I didn't know how to explain. Losing one parent was crushing. Watching the other drift away, toward someone else, was a different kind of loss altogether. That unspoken divide between us kept growing. And years later, it would all come to the surface when I asked her to do the one thing I thought she'd never refuse: walk me down the aisle. By the time I left for college, it had been 6 years since my father's death, but the absence still followed me like a shadow. Family milestones felt different without him. Birthdays, graduations, even casual Sunday dinners. My mother and I spoke often enough, but the closeness we'd once shared had faded into polite updates and the occasional holiday visit. My brother remained her main focus, her point of pride. College was my escape. I chose a university hours away, not just for the degree program, but because it gave me space from the unspoken hierarchy at home. For the first time, I could breathe without feeling like I was standing in someone else's shadow. It was during my second year that I met Daniel. We were paired together for a group presentation in an elective literature course. He was easy to talk to, not just polite, but genuinely interested in what I had to say. Our meeting started in the library, but quickly turned into coffee runs, long walks across campus, and conversations that stretched well past midnight. Daniel had a steadiness to him. Where I was cautious, he was calm. Where I hesitated, he encouraged. He never pushed, just listened, really listened, in a way that made me feel seen. Meeting his family was like stepping into another world. His mother welcomed me with a hug before I'd even set my bag down. His father offered me a seat at the dinner table like I'd been there 100 times before. Their home was warm in a way I hadn't felt in years, not because of the furniture or the decor, but because everyone seemed to belong. The difference was hard to ignore when I spoke to my mother. Our phone calls were short and predictable. I'd share a piece of good news, an A on a project, a part-time job I'd landed, and she'd offer a quick, "That's good," before telling me about my brother's latest success. If I tried to steer the conversation back to my life, she'd find a way to circle it back to him. Daniel noticed. "Maybe she doesn't realize she's doing it," he'd say. "When we get married, she'll have to see you differently. She'll have to see what I see." I wanted to believe him. I wanted to think that, as my only surviving parent, she would step into that aisle walk with pride, that it would be a moment to remind us both that, despite everything, we still had each other. But somewhere in the back of my mind, I knew my mother's attention had a way of narrowing. And if I'd learned anything by then, it was this. When my brother and I were in the same picture, I was rarely the one she focused on. Daniel proposed on an evening so perfect, it felt like it had been stolen from a movie. He recreated our very first date, breakfast at the cafe near campus where we'd once studied for hours, a walk through the park with the same rustling leaves underfoot, and dinner at the small Italian restaurant where we'd celebrated my graduation. When dessert came, there was a velvet box next to my plate. He didn't give a big speech, he just looked at me, his voice steady, and said, "You've been my home from the moment I met you. Will you marry me?" Inside was a ring with a sapphire at its center, framed by small diamonds. Unique, elegant, and unlike anything I'd seen before. That night, I thought about who I'd call first. The obvious answer should have been my father, but he'd been gone for 16 years. That left my mother, the only parent I had left. The thought of her walking me down the aisle wasn't just tradition, it felt like a way to honor both my parents, a chance to have family by my side in a moment where I would feel his absence most. The next morning I called her, my voice light with excitement. I told her about the proposal, the ring, the way Daniel had planned every detail. There was a pause, then a simple, "Well, congratulations. He's a good man." Her tone was polite but distant, like she was responding to an acquaintance's good news. Still, I pushed forward and asked the question that mattered most. "I was hoping you would walk me down the aisle." For a brief moment, her voice softened. "I'd be honored." That was all I needed to hear. I held on to that agreement like a lifeline. It wasn't just a promise. It was a piece of the future I'd been picturing since I was a little girl, one where I'd take that walk with someone who loved me and represented my family. We set the date for the following summer, giving us 9 months to plan. Daniel's family jumped in with enthusiasm. His mother came to dress fittings, her eyes misting as she saw me step out in lace and silk. His father offered to handle transportation for guests. His siblings teased me about cake flavors, but volunteered to help with decorations. I invited my mother to join us for a venue visit, but she said she was busy. I told myself not to dwell on it. She had already agreed to be there when it mattered most. At night, I imagined the moment. The music starting, every head turning, her arm linked with mine as we walked toward the altar. It would be the closest thing I'd have to walking with my father. I didn't know then that she would give up that moment, and that someone else would take her place in a way she'd never forget. It was a Sunday afternoon when my phone rang. I saw my mother's name on the screen and for once felt a spark of hope. Maybe she wanted to ask about the flowers or the dress. Maybe she'd surprise me by offering to help with the seating chart. Instead, her first words were, "I wanted you to hear it from me before you see it on social media. Your brother's getting married." I smiled instinctively, ready to offer congratulations, until she added, "He's set the date for June 15th. My heart dropped. "That's my wedding day." There was a pause, then her voice took on that defensive tone I'd heard many times before. "It's just bad timing, Claire. They didn't plan it to conflict with yours." I gripped the phone tighter. "Mom, I sent you the save the date cards 8 months ago. You told me you put it in your calendar." She sighed, as if I was making too much of it. "They had some venue constraints. This is the only weekend they could get. You know how weddings are." I felt heat rise in my chest. "You promised to walk me down the aisle." "I'll try to make it work," she said, the word try slicing through me. "But you have to understand, this is his big day too. I can't miss it. I have to be there for him. I went silent. I had already lost one parent, the one who should have been there by my side without question. Now, the only person left who could fill that role was telling me she might not even make it. Mom, it's not just about showing up, I said quietly. It's about walking me toward my future. It's about Dad not being there, and you being the one to make sure I'm not alone. Her reply was brisk. You'll still have Daniel. You're not alone. When I hung up, I just sat there, the phone still in my hand. It wasn't about logistics. It wasn't about the date. It was about priority. And for her, I was never first. Daniel found me at the kitchen table, my eyes wet, but my voice sharp with anger. She knew the date, I told him. She agreed to it. And now she's telling me she'll try? His jaw tightened. She's making a choice, and she's not choosing you. I wanted to believe she'd change her mind, that she'd realize what this meant to me and to my father's memory. But deep down, I knew she wouldn't. And I couldn't shake the truth that cut deeper than anything else. She was leaving me to walk alone. In the weeks after that call, my mother's "I'll try" began to crumble into something much smaller. Every conversation became a subtle retreat from the promise she'd made. She'd mention how far the drive would be, how early she'd need to leave my brother's venue to make it to mine, how traffic could make things complicated. One evening she even asked, "Could you move your ceremony back an hour? That might help me get there." I laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was the only thing keeping my voice steady. Mom, this is my wedding day. It's not about what's convenient. 2 weeks before the wedding, the truth came. I was at the dining table, sorting through escort cards when my phone rang. Her voice was unusually formal. "I've been thinking about the timing," she began. "It's just not going to work. Your brother's wedding is important, and I need to be there for him. I won't be able to walk you down the aisle." For a moment, I couldn't even process the words. "You're saying you won't be there?" "It's not about choosing," she said quickly. "It's about logistics. Maybe Daniel's father could walk you. Or a close friend. You'll still have someone." Someone. As though the person walking me toward my future could be swapped like a seat filler at a banquet. I stared at the phone, thinking about my father. About the empty chair at my high school graduation, the missing dance at prom, the way I'd stood alone at every milestone since he died. This, the walk down the aisle, was the one moment I'd clung to as ours, even if ours now meant my mother and me. And now she was taking that too. "I understand," I said finally, though my voice sounded like it belonged to someone else. When I hung up, I sat perfectly still for several minutes before the tears came. They weren't soft or slow. They were the kind that left me gasping, clutching the edge of the table as though it could hold me together. Daniel found me there. He didn't ask what happened. He just knelt beside me, wrapping his arms around my shoulders. "She's making a choice she will regret for the rest of her life," he said, his voice steady but sharp with anger. The next day, word reached his family. I braced for pity, but what I got instead was support. His mother called to say she was proud of the woman I'd become. His sister sent me a message offering to help with anything I needed. And then came the call from his uncle, the one that would change the tone of the day entirely. The call came the evening after my mother's final refusal. I almost let it go to voicemail, but when I saw Daniel's uncle's name flash on the screen, I answered. He'd always been kind to me, warm in a quiet way, but we'd never spoken one-on-one for more than a few minutes at family gatherings. His voice was calm. "Claire, I hope you don't mind me calling. I heard what happened with your mom." I swallowed hard. "Yeah, it's been a week." There was a pause, and then he said something I didn't expect. "I know I can't replace your father, but I would be honored to walk you down the aisle." For a second, I couldn't breathe. My throat tightened, and I had to press my fingers against my eyes to keep the tears from spilling. "Are you sure? It's such an important role." "I'm sure," he said without hesitation. "From the first time I met you, I saw someone who carries herself with grace, even when she's hurting. That's rare. You deserve to have someone by your side, who is there because they want to be, not out of obligation." It was such a simple statement, but it cut through the heaviness I'd been carrying. Since my father died, every milestone had been marked by his absence. High school graduation, college, my first big promotion. He'd been missing from them all. This aisle walk was the one moment I'd pictured for years, the one that still connected me to the idea of family. I had asked my mother to step into that place, not because she was the perfect choice, but because she was the only parent I had left. And she'd said no. Yet here was someone not bound to me by blood, someone who had no obligation, stepping forward without being asked. I accepted. "I'd be honored if you would." From that moment, the weight on my chest began to lift. I didn't tell my mother. Not because I wanted to hide it, but because I wanted the moment to speak for itself. On the day of the wedding, when she saw me walking toward my future with someone else by my side, someone who had chosen me, I wanted that image to stay with her. I threw myself into the final preparations. The flowers, the seating chart, the playlist. My focus shifted. I wasn't going to let her absence be the headline of my wedding. Because I had learned something in that phone call. Family isn't just the people you're born to. Sometimes, it's the ones who choose to stand beside you when no one else will. The morning of my wedding began with a strange mix of emotions. Joy wrapped tightly around a hollow ache. The suite was filled with movement. The rustle of satin gowns, the low hum of hairdryers, the clinking of makeup brushes in glass jars. Roses lined the windowsill, their scent mixing with the faint aroma of coffee. I caught my reflection in the mirror. Hair pinned into soft waves, robe tied at the waist, a small smile tugging at my lips despite the knot in my chest. I'd imagined this day for years, but I'd also imagined a different start. I thought there would be a knock at my door, and my mother, the only parent I had left since my father's death, would be there, ready to take my arm and tell me she was proud. Instead, she was at my brother's wedding, posing for photographs that had nothing to do with me. Guests began arriving downstairs. Through the balcony doors, I could hear laughter and polite conversation drifting up from the garden. Alongside it came quieter whispers, murmurs I didn't need to hear clearly to know what they were about. The empty seat at the front row would speak for itself. My bridesmaids moved around me, fastening jewelry, adjusting the hem of my dress. One leaned in and whispered, "Don't think about her. You've got people here who love you." I nodded, but the truth was, a small part of me still felt the sting. I'd lost my father years ago. Now, my mother had made the choice to be absent too. Then there was a soft knock at the door. Daniel's uncle stepped in, dressed in a tailored suit, his tie perfectly knotted. "You look incredible," he said, his voice steady. "Thank you," I replied, my throat tightening. His presence was grounding, not because he was replacing my father, but because he was choosing to be here in a way my own mother wouldn't. The photographer began directing us into position for pre-ceremony shots. Daniel's uncle didn't hover or try to fill the silence. He just stayed close, a steady presence, reminding me without words that I wouldn't be walking alone. I hadn't told many people who would be walking me down the aisle, not even some of my closest friends. I wanted them to see it unfold in real time. I wanted the surprise to land in the room like a spark, the way I knew it would when my mother realized what she'd given up. The coordinator peeked in to say it was almost time. My hands were steady now. The sadness was still there, but it had transformed into something sharper, more resolute. Because in just a few minutes, everyone would see, and she would know. The music began, soft, steady chords that flowed over the rows of seated guests. My arm was linked with Daniel's uncle, his grip firm but gentle. We took our first step onto the path, and the garden fell silent except for the melody. The faces turned toward us were full of surprise. I caught the flicker of raised eyebrows, quick glances exchanged between guests. They had expected my mother. Instead, they saw him. A man not bound to me by blood, but by choice, walking me toward my future with quiet dignity. I didn't search for her right away. I kept my eyes locked on Daniel, standing at the end of the aisle, his expression a mix of pride and something fiercer, as if he knew exactly how much this moment meant. Each step was a declaration. I am not alone. I am not unwanted. Halfway down the aisle, movement caught my eye near the back. My mother had arrived. She was still in her coat, her hair slightly out of place, as if she'd come straight from my brother's wedding. The moment her gaze landed on us, she froze. Her mouth opened slightly, her eyes narrowing, as if she was trying to make sense of what she was seeing. I watched the realization settle in, that she wasn't part of this moment, that she'd been replaced. A flush crept up her neck, and she began fidgeting with the strap of her purse, her expression twisting into something between disbelief and outrage. By the time we reached the altar, her gaze was burning into my back. Daniel's uncle placed my hand into Daniel's with a soft, "She's all yours," and stepped aside. The ceremony moved forward, but I could feel her energy from across the garden. She shifted in her seat, whispered to someone beside her, looked anywhere but at me. When the officiant pronounced us married and we kissed, she clapped twice, then stopped abruptly, her hands resting stiffly in her lap. Later, at the reception, she found me near the restrooms. Her voice was low, but sharp enough to cut through the noise. "Why didn't you tell me he was walking you down the aisle?" I met her eyes calmly. "Because you told me you couldn't be there. So someone else could." Her lips pressed into a thin line. She stared at me for a beat, then turned and walked away without another word. The rest of the night was filled with dancing, laughter, and the kind of warmth I hadn't felt in years. My father's absence was still there. It always would be, but for once, the empty space had been filled by someone who chose to stand beside me when it mattered most. Sometimes family isn't about blood. It's about who shows up when the moment is too important to be left empty. Have you ever had to replace someone in a moment that should have been theirs? Or been replaced yourself? Tell me in the comments. And if you believe we should honor those who choose us, subscribe for more stories like this.